You're listening to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast, presented by Pinelands Nursery. Here are your hosts, Fran Chismar and Tom Kinezic.
Welcome back to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast presented by Pinelands Nursery. I am Fran Chismar.
And I am Tom Kinezic. Welcome to episode 175. And Fran, this is one that you particularly are very giddy for.
I am. I feel like a little kid.
I'm trying to think of the way to, best word.
I'll say, and I've mentioned
attitude.
this before on the podcast. It's been a long time since I've gotten like a little butterflies before a podcast. It's probably been over 100 episodes, and I'm like, I'm past that. I got butterflies today, so yeah. It's one of those things where, when you're looking at being environmentally conscious, inspiration can come in many different forms, and it doesn't always work. I know, say with my wife Agatha, I've given her Bringing Nature Home.
Yes, yeah,
and it's just for her. She's like, I just feel like I'm reading facts. Mm-hmm. And it's not entertaining. But then there's certain other things I can give her that resonates to her on a whole different level.
Yeah. But
has the same effect. And that's how I feel about this guest.
Yeah. And that's something we've always tried to highlight is connections come in many different ways, and
there's different paths and different times.
Yeah, when you're talking to other people and trying to get them excited about native plants, well, they might not care about plants, but they're going to have something they're passionate about, and it's connecting them to their passions. But yeah, we have a really good guest today, someone that a lot of folks have written in and asked us to have on. So I would like to introduce everyone to Camille Dungy. And Camille, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do and where you are with your native plant journey?
Great, thank you. That's quite an introduction. I really appreciate hearing that, and I'm super excited to be talking to you today. So my name, as you said, is Camille Dungy, and I'm the author most recently of a book-length narrative called Soil, The Story of a Black Mother's Garden. And it released in May of 2023. It is... The short version of the book is that it's the story of 7 years of my family's journey to diversify the landscape in our own backyard from the ground up. And part of that effort is a decision to plant primarily native plants with an eye towards creating a pollinator-friendly, low water, welcoming space around our landscape. We live in northern Colorado. We moved from the Bay Area of California to northern Colorado, which was in many ways quite a change because the climate here is so different, let's just say, from that more temperate California climate. And so there was a lot of learning. It was a steep learning curve for me in particular. I'm the primary gardener in the family, to figure out how to plant here. And we can talk a little bit as we keep talking about why native plants became the obvious solution for that. So I live in northern Colorado. I teach at Colorado State University. That's what brought us here. We have a daughter, and so a lot of the book also has to do with mothering and questions that I have about the canon of environmental literature and why so frequently I don't see questions of parenthood and motherhood in particular directly engaged with conversations about environment, and why I think that might be a major omission. And since you are listening and not seeing me, I will also add that I am African American, and many of the questions that the book goes through have to do with what it means to be a Black person living in a predominantly white space making decisions about what my yard looks like and also who lives in my house and what we're doing in the world. And so all those intersections end up showing up throughout the book.
It's a wonderful book, and I spoke beforehand that I'm not quite through it yet, but I've already bought 3 copies, and that's how much I'm enjoying it. I guess, is it a spoiler alert if I ask you what the current progress is on your prairie project?
I don't think it's a spoiler alert. Right. I think, gardens are such changeable beasts that where it is now and where it'll be next year will be different. There's a big chunk of the book that's dedicated to a particular plot in our yard that my family calls the Prairie Project. And it was about 1,000 square feet of turf that was just bad. It was just turf and thistle and dandelion and creeping Charlie and crabgrass and not useful to pretty much anyone. And so we pulled that sod in October of 2019. That was a quite speaking of learning curves, an adventure. I made a series of bad decisions about the timing of pulling the sod and getting the replacement soil, et cetera, that brought us all together in the end. But there were some challenges. And then I planted it out in June of 2020. And so by the end of the book, I'm describing this project, but it was still kind of in its infancy, that particular thing. This year, we had a record amount of rain, and it's also the 4th year of the garden. And so it is thick and lush. There's one plant that was supposed to be a dwarf rabbit brush. There is nothing dwarf about this rabbit brush. It is giant, and so I need to think about that. And the milkweed has really exploded in that area. There's some flowers throughout it that are probably 13 feet tall, and so I had to the other day actually kind of weave some rope through the sunflowers and milkweed to kind of help stand it up, because otherwise you couldn't walk on the pathway. It was just so completely overrun, like some sort of mythic fable land, which is strange in Colorado because we're so arid. We're just not used to having a tropical jungle forest yard. That's a little what it's like this year. So it's kind of exciting.
It's such a learning curve, as you mentioned. And Tom and I have this conversation all the time because we'll be looking at a plant that's supposed to get 3 foot tall, and we'll see it 6 foot tall. And maybe it's getting way better conditions than what it's used to. You may be taking such great care of these plants that they're so happy that it's like, we can, we have room to grow,
to stretch out, all that.
So we find that all the time.
Yeah. Can I ask you what species of milkweed you have in your garden?
I have a few kinds. The one that has really flourished in that spot is showy milkweed, and then I've got some narrow leaf milkweed, and one the official name of which I can't remember, but it's got an orange flower, and
butterfly weed,
maybe.
Okay.
Yes, and there is one other that is kind of native to the kind of Colorado eastern section of Colorado that also is here, but the showy is being very showy. The narrow leaf hasn't flowered out yet. It usually flowers out later in the season, around September or so, and so it's probably about to do its thing.
Yeah, some different ones than we're used to here on the East Coast, that's for sure. That's why I wanted you to list them out, because I always love hearing some of the different stuff that people get to experience.
And have you gotten your monarch caterpillars or chrysalises yet?
I haven't seen any chrysalises. I'm always really careful to check, because when I cut it back, I have heard that cutting back the milkweed is useful because the caterpillars like new growth. So it's useful to me because it's so big right now, but also better for the caterpillars. But so when I do the cutting, I really try and make sure that there's nothing on it. And I haven't seen any. I've only seen a couple monarchs in the yard at all this year, which is always really sad. We've had a lot of rain, like I say, so I don't know how that's impacting the migration.
I know when we first planted it in our yard, it took us 2 or 3 years before we started to see monarchs or caterpillars. It was, we had an instance where my wife was picking out the seedlings that were coming up from it overseeding, and she was bare rooting them and taking them into work and handing them out to coworkers. She brought them in the house and realized there was a caterpillar on one of the ones that she pulled out. So she babied this thing. It made a chrysalis. It was like she raised her own baby, and we brought it outside after it hatched, and she put it on the milkweed plant, and a bird came down and swooped and got it immediately. After all that, we were taking pictures. It was like we just brought a baby home from the hospital, and then bird just swooped down and got it right away.
Oh my goodness. I mean, it is the cycle of life, wow, that's hard.
I know. If I could ask, what inspired you to write about this process, and who were you hoping that it would resonate with? I love the fact that it's told from the perspective of a mother, and Tom can attest for this, that we had done an episode probably a year and a half ago called Women in Ecology, where we brought some of our peers on to discuss some of their experiences in the industry. And it was so eye-opening for us when they started having the conversation about, well, they don't make women's clothes for this. Mm-hmm. This, like, we had to buy men's clothes, and they're like, try being pregnant and doing this, and it's obviously it's something I hadn't thought about, but it made us really stop and rethink everything. So that's kind of what this book is helping me do. And I'm just curious who you thought who the person you thought would be reading this book, and why this particular journey was fascinating for you to dive into.
That's a great question. And my answer by the end of the book of writing and revising this book is a very different answer than the answer at the beginning of the process. I think in the beginning of the process, I was maybe more aligned with the dominant narrative that I receive in my training. And throughout the book, I really talk about my training. I think there's a lot of that sort of confirmation bias that happens, or just we know what we're taught and we see what we've been told to look for. And so what I knew was that in my education process, except for the places where I sort of actively sought otherwise, I didn't see people of color, and I didn't see many women who were mothers speaking about active environmental engagement. And I have a lot of explanations for why that is, but in the beginning of writing the story, I was actively pushing against that in maybe earlier versions of this book were maybe more argumentative, like, hey, I'm here, like in this like kind of demanding kind of way. And over time, I got tired of that stance, and I imagined that readers would get tired of reading with that kind of combative, defensive thing. And I shifted my idea of who I was writing for to the people who I knew were out there, who also have felt these absences and would be excited to see a story that resonated with them or reflected some aspect of their life on the page. And so I shifted to a kind of more communal, loving, celebratory stance, I think, over the course of revising this book, which is, I hope, what you feel now in this process. And there is a little bit of like, if somebody doesn't believe that I should be there, no amount of my insisting, like, I should be here is going to change this person's mind, right? So that was wasted energy. The other thing that I feel is important to add is that a lot of this book was written in 2020. Which means that I was home and I was seeing more, as many of us were during that time, kind of observing more questions of environmental justice and social justice, but also just because more of us were home, we were noticing the birds and the insects and the plants that were around us in ways that we hadn't. And so the time in which I was writing the book also shifted the tone in which I was writing the book, because that sort of patience that came with understanding that moving slowly and looking closely was so deeply rewarding, that built into the process of writing the book as well.
I completely understand what that if let's say if we were having this conversation 4 years ago, I think it would have been a completely different conversation. COVID, for me, we started this podcast 2 weeks before COVID hit, before the lockdown. Mm-hmm. And I because of COVID, this podcast has grown. I've become a birder. A lot of our trips are based on nature-based things. And I'm in the industry, and I just didn't have that same connection that I feel I have because of that experience. In many ways, it was a very eye-opening experience because of COVID, what it forced us to do. And I'm kind of thankful that the path that we're on is because of that. Mm-hmm. Did you ever think or realize that your book would be as important as it is in the ecology circle? Like I would put this, as far as there's many books that you could say are required reading if you're in environmental or ecology circles, but I'll put this one with Breeding Sweetgrass and Sand County Almanac, because it's not all. It's more that emotional. It speaks on an emotional connection, but each does it in their own way. That many books don't. They're factual, but they don't make you feel.
I feel deeply honored to be put in the company of those two books, which I find such beautiful, important, instructive books. And I mean, so maybe the short answer to that question is, sure, that would be a goal, to walk alongside Robin Wall Kimmerer and Aldo Leopold, like those such wonderful ways of being and seeing, understanding reciprocity, understanding the patience that it takes to rebuild a landscape. They were definitely writers, thinkers, and doers whose ideas I had in mind while I was writing. I guess I want my work to reach as broadly. I mean, I say this in the book, like if I build a space of welcome, I want its reach to be wide. And so I am excited if in the world of ecology that this is a space where the book finds a home.
Did you, when you were finishing the book, did you feel that you had written something special? Like, I don't know, like for your process, like through having written multiple books, like, is it always the same feeling when you're done? Was one of them more special than another? Did you have, like, when you were done, you're like, I feel good about this one? Like, I'm assuming before you put something out, you feel good about it, but did you feel different about this one?
I did feel differently about this one. I trained primarily as a poet, and so 4 of my books are collections of my own poetry. I have 3 other anthologies that I edited or had a role in editing. So in that way, this book is different because it's primarily a prose narrative. I do weave poems throughout the collection because that's another way of seeing. And I think that that's a way in which Soil is a different book than any other book that I've written because it integrates prose and poetry and visual art as well, because throughout the book, there are photographic images that either the photos taken in the garden by my daughter or our friend Mary Ellen, who we then shared with a photographic artist named Dion Lee, who made these incredible photogram images. There's also clippings from the yard, which I sent to Dion, and she made these gorgeous images from them. I wanted that, since as readers went through the book, if they didn't know what they were looking for, I wanted them to stay in the book and not go to Google. And so from early on in the book, you have these images, and I just wanted trust from the reader that there would be enough guidance for what it was that they were looking at or reading about, that they could just keep reading in the book. And so one of the things that felt very different about this book was that intersection of multiple kinds of ways of knowing and understanding and describing this landscape that I hadn't done that kind of multimedia work. In the audiobook you mentioned, there's a moment where you get to hear song, my daughter and I singing. And so that's the kind of value added bit that you get in the audiobook. There's also maps in the book. And so that's one way. When the sort of whole thing came together, I was like, this is a rich kind of intertextual, multi-layered, diverse landscape inside this book, which felt different than anything else I'd done.
I was surprised because I had the audiobook first, and I love that you can hear you and your daughter singing, or there's bits of music. And then I got the book and I was like, oh, I was missing all of this as well. But I love that each one was their own experience in a multimedia way. So,
yeah.
So I feel like maybe we skipped forward a little bit. Should we go back?
We sure did.
We should go back. Sorry. I told you we would get sidetracked.
But we really wanted to dive into how you were inspired to connect with nature. Was it something that happened through childhood, or was it something you came into as an adult? We just want to know where that inspiration came from.
Oh, Tom with the easy question. That's like, what? I don't, I feel like I do have one straightforward answer to this question. To me, is that the house I grew up in, where I spent the majority of my childhood, was really this epitome of what environmental science people call an ecotone, like this liminal space between two kinds of zones of life. And so if you walked out my front door in this Orange County planned community home, my front door, it was like terraced streets and really, really rigidly designed, every fourth house looks the same kind of structure. You couldn't leave your garage door open for more than 4 hours, like a really rigid human built environment. But if you walked out my back door, it was essentially virgin landscape. There was like, it hadn't been touched, and which was bizarre in that kind of Southern California place, right? Like most of the outdoor spaces are really highly cultivated and tended and cared for, even if they're supposed to be kind of natural preserves. But this was just like a wild hillside with caves and canyons, and I've learned how to watch out for rattlesnakes when I was walking through the sage. And so I had this kind of one version of untrammeled, wild, open space. And then I had this very, very human built space. And then my parents in this little in between space of our home made these radically progressive, now that I think about it, decisions in the 1970s to do a low water, often native or appropriate for California climate landscaping in our yard. And so I had like all of that was available to me. And I didn't know any different, you know? And so when it came for me to start writing, the language from which I was drawing was sometimes the language about the front door and the people stuff, and sometimes the language about the back door, or sometimes this kind of in between of how a family navigates that and builds some sort of continuity in it. That was just the well that my stories and my language choices were drawing from. And then I moved to the East Coast. I had lived always in the American West or Midwest until I was 24, I guess. And I moved to the East Coast where I stayed for 11 years. And it's different over there. You have different birds. Your trees are different. Your grass is different. Like everything is different. And the air feels different. And so I had to spend a lot of time just figuring out what was different, why I felt different, why I kept wanting to write about the West, even though it's pretty over there. The East Coast is lovely, you know, but like, I was like, I don't want to write about this. I want to write about something else. So I think it was that just really thinking about starting to pay attention then as I was training as a writer to what I was paying attention to in the world. And a lot of it had to do with environment and what grew around me.
That's amazing for the 70s that your parents were doing that for water-wise. We're still struggling with people not fully embracing that that concept today, and to go back at that time, that's really progressive.
I know, right? And I don't think I realized it, which is the thing about often, right? The worlds in which we grow up, that's just normal, you know? And then I'm like, oh, wait, no, that was not normal. Like drip irrigation in a home in 1975.
Wow.
Like who was doing that? My dad.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. We have the talk with listeners all the time about when you're starting to venture into native plants, maybe, you know, not everyone's ready for that or that look, and maybe start in the backyard and let the backyard be a little more wild and keep the front yard maybe a little nicer at first, just to keep the neighbors happy, and slowly have that conversation and progress. But it's interesting that that's a conversation we're having today, but here 50 years ago, that amazes me.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, I do write about this a little bit in Soil. It was not a simple decision, as it turns out, that to do that took time. It takes time. It takes patience. You don't just like go to the box store and pick up whatever and throw it in the ground. You have to decide what's going to work with certain light and things. And so my parents, the front yard took longer to put in place than the neighborhood association approved of. And so there was conflict around their decision to take it slow and make those choices. And that also things can often take longer to come in, right? I think a lot of native plants take a while to reach their pretty phase. They go through a gawky phase that's a lot longer than a lot of plants that are cultivated for American show gardens. And so, you know, that kind of explaining to your neighbors, just wait, in 3 years, this is going to look fantastic. But it's hard to trust that. For me, still, this year, you were asking what the state of the yard is now. My big project this year, we took all the rest of the Kentucky bluegrass out from every place else that it was in the yard. But my daughter still wanted a lawn because she's a kid and she wants a lawn. So I just exchanged the Kentucky bluegrass for buffalo grass and blue grandma grass, which meant that we had it grows so slowly, the buffalo grass. So we had like a solid month and a half of just dirt. Like it just looked like dirt. And then like the weeds were like, hey, here I am, like it was just like, and I had just published this book about creating this beautiful garden. And I was like, people are going to drive by and laugh, because it looks bad. Now it looks gorgeous, right? But in May and June, it looked trashy, like really not good, right? And I just had to believe that it was gonna be okay.
No, it's we, even for people in the industry, when we sell seed mixes, we have to have those conversations because we're like, some things are going to come up early. And it's like succession. You'll see those things early and they're not going to stay forever. But some of the things you really want to see, it's going to take 2, 3, 4 years before that meadow really matures enough to where you're right. It goes through that awkward gangly stage. And then you have to, before it matures to where you get what you were hoping for. It's just the patience for that, which is hard sometimes. Especially when people are looking at it every day. Like that's where it gets, it's like, no, it's trust me, like it will transform. Do you think, and I want to mention, because you mentioned it in your book about dealing with the HOA, but before, because I don't want to forget to mention it, but having lived in a lot of places throughout the country and the world, do you think nature is one thing that helped keep you grounded? Like you mentioned that, from the West Coast and East Coast, it's different birds, different grasses. Do you think that was a constant for you, having like that experience growing up and just seeing that kind of helped make more places feel like home?
I think so. I think learning to talk to the trees and look to trees and look for flowers. I like going, I travel a lot, and I like seeing what the progression of growth is in springtime. As I go different places, we're pretty high in both latitude and altitude here. So where I am in Colorado, it's the same latitude as New York, which is a relatively high latitude, but it's we're at 5,000 feet. And so it's significantly cooler. I think that means like that translates to about 4.5 degrees of temperature difference, which is significant, as we know. So I can go in May to New York and like they've got all kinds of things are already in bloom that we aren't on daffodils yet. We're just still on the crocuses, or they're already to their irises and like we're just on crocuses, So like that kind of sense of comparison, I guess, of where other places are in their season and in their growing season and in their blooming processes in comparison to the places I call home, helps ground me. Yes.
That's and I've mentioned this before in the podcast. My wife is from Poland, and she grew up on a small farm during communist Poland, and her connection with nature is very different than mine. And I feel like she has a deeper connection than I, even though I want to have that connection, she inherently has it. I came home the other day from work and she was laying in the middle of the backyard, just like on her back, arms and legs out. And I walked out, I was like, what you doing? And she's like, I'm having a conversation with nature. I'm like, okay, are you actually talking? She goes, no, I'm just transferring my energy right now. I'm good. And it was like, yeah, I get it, but I probably not something I maybe would have done, and it was just having that feeling. I don't know. Everyone has it in a different way and everyone's in different parts of her journey. I just thought that was a very unique way for her to interact with nature and for her to feel at home. Like I know when she feels homesick, that's what she kind of does. Like when she thinks about Poland, she'll be like, okay, I can, these things remind me of home.
That's beautiful. I love that idea too, which which I think about a lot, of how we communicate. This idea that you put forward, like, oh, are you communicating? Are you actually
talking? Yeah.
Are you actually talking out loud? Versus my, like, this idea that, like, a lot of communication happens non-verbally. And a lot of communication definitely happens not in English. And so, like, I like to think a lot when I'm out there in my yard about how I'm communicating with the other living beings that are around me. That not being always dependent on speaking English, that to hold a tree, to touch a tree, to water things, to prune things as they need them. I do a lot of, when I do pruning, I'm often talking to the plants I'm pruning, kind of like, almost like I don't have a domesticated pet, but like, I imagine if I had like a dog or something, when you're like clipping their toenails or cutting their hair and they're not so into it, but you're like just talking them through why it is that this is, it's just, honestly, you're going to be a lot happier. You're going to have fewer mats and et cetera. And like, so that, I often find myself doing that when I'm doing the work of pruning and managing out there, that feels sometimes necessary for me, so I can walk through, but sometimes it is in fact better for the plants. And we've eradicated many of the other beings who would be doing that work elsewhere. And so, since there are no bison here anymore, right? What is it that I can do to sort of replace the role that the bison would play in the sunflower stands? Like, how can I kind of recreate that energy in that kind of communication?
And that's why it's so important to have different voices in these conversations, because if you're only hearing the same voice over and over, you're not expanding, you're not seeing a different point of view, you're not getting different experiences. And had I not had that conversation, had I come home a half an hour later and not seen my wife do that, maybe I wouldn't have ever had that idea or thought or that connection. And that's why I feel that your book is so important, because it's coming from a perspective that is not often heard in our industry, from an African-American woman, from a wife, from a mother. And those are voices you don't hear, but they're just as important, if not more important, because we don't hear them. It's so, I don't want to say shielded, but it's just we don't get those voices coming through very often.
Yeah. Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, I was going to say, something I'll even add to that is I was paging through an industry magazine the other day, and there's an article I read by a really esteemed, I don't know, garden writer, plant writer, I guess, and fairly short, but it was about how the myth of how native plants are better for pollinators is kind of what it was about. And I just left it on Fran's desk and then didn't really say anything, just want to see what he thought. And then I wasn't at my desk when Fran read it, and he just wrote, "This guy just sounds out of touch." But it was basically saying, zinnias are great for pollinators, and so is Budley and all this other stuff. And it was like, you could just tell he didn't get it. He was looking at it through the lens of, this plant is in the garden. Oh, and it can help it looks beautiful. Oh, maybe it helps pollinators too. And that was it. That was the end of the story for him. And
I kind of felt bad because, all right, we keep saying you have to have patience and be kind and let everyone take that journey themselves. And he just sounded like an angry man. And it was and I could be reading into this because this is someone that has made a career off of introducing plant material. And I felt like, oh, well, it's hurting his wallet, and he's showing a little anger here. I kind of felt like he very outwardly published his ignorance towards he was approaching it as a gardener and not an environmentalist. And that's fine. Not everyone is an environmentalist. You have the journey. It just hit the voice that he chose to write the article wasn't very certain.
And that was I guess part of what I was trying to get at is like he's coming at it from one angle and saying, oh, thinking about pollinators from an ecosystem services standpoint, but that's not the only ecosystem service that native plants can play. That's not the only role they play, and the only interactions they need with wildlife. There's so many other interactions that are really important, like being eaten is one of them, not just attracting because you have nectar. You need the caterpillars to eat you too. But then like the whole foraging aspect and how this can be food for us as well. And then just we can get, and I'm going to say we, I'm saying Fran and I can kind of get blind because we're working at a native plant nursery where our goal is to sell native plants to restoration projects. So that's our primary lens, but even we can be blind to some of the other uses. So that's, yeah, like what Fran was saying, it's really important to have all these voices come together because there are so many different reasons why nature and ecosystems and native plants are important, and we need to at least hear all those reasons. Yeah. We can't just, we can have our favorites, but
and our voice isn't going to reach everyone. We don't speak to everyone. That's why it's important to have a lot of voices.
I have two thoughts as a result of what you're talking about. One, just like a quick response is like all of those plants that you mentioned, which are not necessarily native plants, can be beneficial for some pollinators, right? Some pollinators will come there. But the thing that's interesting to me about choosing native plants is the diversity of pollinators that I now see here, that I'm not just seeing European honeybees and swallowtails. I'm seeing like so many kinds of bees and flies and things that I had not, that I really hadn't witnessed before. And so that kind of variety, that there's certain kinds of creatures who are more interested in. And then the other thing that I find fascinating really about many of these native plants is the ways that for me, they became portals into history, that I came to understand something about this place that I've decided to make my home. As I researched the plants and found out what lived here, I didn't know before writing this book. I really didn't know before writing this book that sunflowers were a native North American species, because I think of sunflowers as those Russian sunflowers or the kind of sunflowers in Van Gogh or something like that. So I thought that they were European. I didn't realize that they were taken from North America, exported to Europe, and then oftentimes brought back and rehybridized here with our American species. So those kinds of ways that the native plants here have taught me things about trade and connections with others, about indigenous foodways and thought processes, and just what this space I want to call home might have looked like 250 years ago. All of that to me, it feels like one of the really exciting rewards of dealing with native plants. But even, North America has such a robust native plant heritage, really, that I just learned today from reading Rebecca Solnit's book, Orwell's Roses, which is a beautiful book. I would absolutely recommend. I just learned in reading that the dahlia was originally a plant from Mexico, Central America, and then was taken to Europe, hybridized, renamed, and brought back. So I really was thinking that my dahlias were not a native species that I planted in my yard, but in fact, they are a native North American species. Those particular hybrids that I have may not be. But that to me, I just feel when I do this work with that kind of slightly more conscious way of thinking about it, that I end up, back to your point, Fran, feeling more grounded, feeling more located in this place I call home, over a really long haul. Like, so I'm thinking about it way back into the past, and I'm thinking about the ways that the things that we plant in our yard will make a difference towards what kind of future we have too.
Stay tuned for more of the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast, presented by Pinelands Nursery. Welcome back to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast, presented by Pinelands Nursery.
History is so important, and so much of that is lost. I feel to a certain extent, it's almost like wondering how the pyramids were built when you think about how indigenous cultures use some of these native plants and how it's been lost, or how the government chose to. We had a really interesting talk with Sam Thayer about the heritage of foraging.
Oh, yeah.
And he was like, if you don't mind, let's get real political about this, and how the government.
Yeah, you can't talk about it honestly without getting political about it.
Exactly. And it's part of the conversation, but it's so much of that has been lost. And that was his point, that even when you go to some of these cultures, they're not sure anymore. And it's such a sad thing. So researching and finding the history and bringing these things back and reconnecting is in a way like something that, like, more feeling at being a part of it rather than being, so many people think it's us and then there's nature, out
Right.
there, instead of we're all an integral part of nature together. We're part of that community.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't grow many things that are considered vegetable garden. I always have some tomatoes. I try some peas, but different summers I will have more. This summer I did not have very much, but I did walk out just the other day. I was like, actually, I have a grocery store out here, right? Because I planted all these native plants. Like, we don't have to go wanting. A lot of these tubers can be used as food. A lot of the leaves or the flowers could be like the tips of my spruce tree, like all of these things that are just here in my not particularly big yard could sustain my family for quite some time. And so part of what I worked on as I was writing Soil was reframing my thought process away from a homogenized thought process that thought that the only way that I could access food is by growing carrots and onions. And I've got wild onion all over this yard, right? And I've got a lot that could be used in these sustaining kind of ways. So I feel like one of the exciting possibilities of gardening and the way that my family has chosen to garden is the way that it has helped us reframe our ideas about beauty, utility, and connection. And that I often end up having to do things in this garden that may not have been considered beautiful in a particular version of what a garden looks like. But as I grow patience and also shift my perspective, I understand its incredible, complex beauty and utility in super exciting ways.
That's wonderful. I just learned about, side note, about eating spruce tips through Alexis Nicole. I don't know if you do social media. She goes by the Black Forager on Instagram.
She's fantastic.
Yeah, she's incredible. She's incredible. But as I was reading the book, and you may have meant it this way, or maybe it just happened that way, I keep looking at your meadow project as a metaphor for diversity and equity.
Absolutely.
In life. And it became really obvious to me as I kept going. And I'm like, I don't know if this was intended on purpose or if that's just how it wove together, but you can't help but to see the similarities and what works and what doesn't work, or maybe how it should be.
Absolutely. I mean, when I say that, this sort of redefining or widening the lens of what is beautiful and what is allowed to grow and where, when my family is the only all Black family in our neighborhood. And we're also, so our very presence is redefining some ideas about what things are supposed to look like and where they're supposed to show up. And then we're making these decisions in our yard also, which are both factually different than the decisions that other people are making, and also metaphorically different. Yeah.
So I know I mentioned earlier HOA, and you had talked about being in an HOA at the start of this. As your meadow progresses or your prairie progresses, has that become an issue in your HOA at all?
Oh, it's the opposite, actually. Okay. When I started the project, I actually kind of started small because our HOA had rules on the books saying that there couldn't be an unmanageable and what was some of the other language? It had to be I'm sorry, I can't remember what the actual language was, but essentially it's like, you should look right, right? You should sort of, there were questions about height, the height of grass and aesthetic appeal, etc. And so at first I just started with one very small square that I made out of old railroad tiles that were in the backyard. And I just made a square with these railroad tiles, probably 4x4, right? And smothered the turf there and put in a wildflower seed packet, in the fall. We'll just see what comes up in the spring. I don't tend to do that anymore because you just, I don't know what's in those packets. And often like what ends up taking off is actually not something that I'm going to want in Colorado, right? It's like not necessarily specific for my place. But that was how I started it. And then I had another patch of sunflowers in a place that was just like dead grass. And that was it. And I kind of knew that if I started small and kept creeping larger, that by the time they like caught up to what I was doing, I just trusted that the HOA would have caught up to why as well, because we live in Colorado. There are water scarcity issues. There's all more and more conversation about supporting our local pollinators, et cetera. I just trusted that this was the right thing to do and that I could start small and go big. I also started small just because I do most of this myself. And so it was just what I was capable of doing in terms of time and finances, right? Start small, grow. Over the time, we've been here for 10 years now, the HOA has shifted those rules. Wow. The state of Colorado has a ballot measure right now that will say that HOAs cannot tell you that you cannot have water-wise gardening methods, right? And so like a statewide question about whether or not this is the proper thing for HOAs to have authority over. And then our city has an incentive program now. In fact, we had to delay our conversation because we were scheduled for yesterday. And that was the day that my Zero-Scape incentive program person was going to come by and make sure that this Buffalo Grass project was actually what I said it was. And so the city is incentivizing this kind of work at this point. And so my faith in the beginning that if I started slowly and got larger, the community would catch up has been realized.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. How did the meeting go yesterday?
It went great.
Awesome. Awesome.
They really liked it.
So I wanted to touch a little bit on equity in nature. And for me, it always feels weird having these conversations as a white male, but it's important to have these conversations. And I was just shocked to learn the other day while I was researching for this episode of the podcast, I was reading other reviews on soil, and someone had mentioned that in Texas, I can't remember what part of Texas, but if you have equity in your curriculum, they cut funding because they don't want it taught. And that shocked me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's a state. They just had like a state measure, state bill. But it's a statewide issue. Texas, Tennessee, and Florida are places where those are now like there's laws about not being able to talk about equity, about issues of the parts of our historical stories that are not particularly flattering to the white American project, because they are about the unequal burden of hardship that people of color in this country have often had to face. And for me, there's no real way to talk about the land in any part of America, but certainly not the American West, without thinking about questions of equity, questions of violence and brutality, of rewriting, reshaping the courses of nature. But also, here's the thing, there's no way to make the necessary changes that we are all going to have to make in order to keep this planet livable without confronting, engaging with, absorbing, and finding new solutions for the decisions that have been made in our past. Right. And so throughout Soil, I'm often like just running up against these kinds of moments of terror or trauma or grief, and trying to figure out how to digest them and continue to move forward. And the garden gives me a space for that. It gives me metaphors for that. In the sense that soil itself, there's no way for soil to be viable without a certain amount of violence and death and decomposition and awfulness. But true soil figures out how to absorb that and make that something new and beautiful and fertile. So like that's again one of these kind of factual / metaphorical things about this process.
Yeah, definitely. And it's when you think of soil as something that's living, where dirt is something that's not, and it's and all the things that have to happen. It's one of those parts of the wheel. Like you can say you need the sun, you need the plants to absorb the energy, but without the soil, nothing's growing for any of that. It doesn't matter. And it's I found that as a very fitting title for the book, which I really appreciate it. Yeah, it's, and I know it may sound grandiose to sit here and plan, like, how do we fix this? But, like, what are some of the things that can be done to help in having these conversations about equity?
I feel like insisting you said something when you brought the question up, I feel a little awkward as a white man. No, like, make the space, right? Like, you're making the space is incredibly important because of the people who are listening to you, the people who are coming to speak with you and listen to you means that the reach that my story has makes new kinds of connections that it might not otherwise, that somebody might not pick up a book because Black Mother is in the title. But after you've talked about the book and the ways that you're understanding it and kind of absorbing and integrating the information makes it, there is something in here also for me. So I think that's it for me, really, is that all of us take up the charge and do this work knowing that sometimes it's going to be awkward and difficult and uncomfortable, because really, what is it that any of us do in our lives that's worthwhile, that doesn't have some element of discomfort and awkwardness? There's nothing that's worthwhile that doesn't have that.
Thank you. It is, and you write about it so well. Was it hard for you to do? As you mentioned earlier, there's so many different voices that you could take to tell that story. how difficult was it for you to, was it, obviously it was important to you to write about it. Was it hard to write about?
It was so hard. It was so hard on a practical sense, because I was writing it, a lot of it during 2020, when I was the one responsible for overseeing my 4th and 5th grade daughter's education, which was crazy to be trying to do that and, and work on a book at the same time. So there's just like practically thinking about how to do that. And, circling way back to one of your questions about like why it felt important for me to write about motherhood, is that I realized in that process, like, why don't I read that much of this kind of literature where somebody's like trying to juggle writing about my like wrapped incredible love affair with the greater than human world, and like, oh, I have to do the dishes now and make dinner and the laundry, right? Like, why don't I see that? Because that's actually the life that a lot of us have, right? A lot of us have that sort of divided attention and don't get the like privilege of just having a month by ourselves in the wilderness. And so living that made me feel it necessary to write that truth into the book. But that was also difficult. Like, then that's like intellectually difficult. How do I write something that I don't have much record of seeing elsewhere in the literature? How do I even construct it? What are the sentences I use? What are the details that I have, so that people can experience the world that's inside my house as well as outside my house? So this is in many ways, and for several reasons, the hardest book that I've ever written. And then I'm also was confronting a lot of racialized trauma that I was experiencing, or that my family was experiencing. And so writing those stories, and being really honest with my white friends about how their responses to a lot of those situations were often not helpful and sometimes just hurtful, even when these are people who have my best interest at heart. Like, but I had a lot of conversations actually in the process of writing. I would go on walks with friends and things and be like, I don't want you to feel bad, but I need to be honest. And my friends would say, yes, you need to be honest, and I need to know the truth, right? And so that sort of conversation, the trust, again, that I'm writing to readers who want to build a better world. That's what I just had to lean into in the end. The people who are going to pick up this book want to build a sustainable, loving, welcoming world. And sometimes the instruction for how to do that is going to hit hard. And sometimes that's what we need.
And I appreciate that. And those conversations I appreciate your honesty in having those conversations, because those conversations aren't easy a lot of the times. It could have been just as easy to say, I'm not going to deal with it, whatever, and walk away. And I think sometimes that's a very male thing, like to walk away and just say whatever. And I know, again, I'm going to mention my wife. She was just sharing with me a conversation she had. She started school, and one of her coworkers that she's been working with for a long time, she's a teacher, started transitioning over the summer. And she wasn't aware that this was going to happen. So she had a talk with her yesterday and say, I love you, and just this is hard because I know this person, and I'm in mourning that this person kind of exists and doesn't exist anymore. But I want to let you know I'm on your side, and I hope you're doing well, and I'm working through this. And I'm like, I don't know that I would have done that. And and they had a very, very special moment because of this. And it's like, wow, I hope that one day I can do that, or I hope that I would have that conversation in the same space.
That's such a beautiful and wise way of understanding how we mourn those kinds of changes sometimes, that how and why, what it is that we're mourning, or when we get angry, or That's really wonderful. I have a lot of students who are gender non-binary or are transitioning, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel along with your wife, like it's an interesting world to live in. I found myself writing about the way that gender shows up in the world, right? In the greater than human world, in soil. And that was part of my way of processing it. And like just how frequently there are these living beings out there who are not just one gender, their whole life cycle, right? And so what that means to see varieties of gender expression as a natural facet of the world in which we live. And so that kind of expansiveness, I think, again, like connecting deeply and thoughtfully with the greater than human world has helped me connect more deeply and more thoughtfully with humans.
Yeah.
And it's, we can describe ourselves in many different ways. We all wear a lot of different hats. And it's, here we are on a podcast talking about plants. And even though I work in a nursery where we grow plants, there's many days I don't get to deal or even see the plants. It's just part of the everyday. And we all have that in our lives. And there's many different ways you can describe yourself. But you've managed to kind of encapsulate all that in this book at the same time because it's all important. I don't want to say with the everyday and the important. It's because it's all important because it's who we are. And it's just, we had a conversation in the office. Tom wasn't in here at the time that we were having it. And someone mentioned, if I were to say, picture this dog, and they started describing it. And I'm like, all right. And they're like, do you see it? I'm like, yeah. They're like, not everyone can see that. You may, and not everyone thinks the same way. So even though you may have never have ever questioned your gender, there's people that constantly question it. And it's just your brain doesn't see that, their brain does. Your brain sees the dog, someone else's brain doesn't. And it's just important to remember that when you're thinking about it. And it's easy to forget sometimes or not understand. But when you put it those ways or that way. But that and I kind of felt that's what was so important about the book is how you kind of included everything in there. Even I enjoyed the story about you not picking on your husband for knowing the difference between a duck and a gull. Because it's part of the learning process. It is. And it's
Fran, I feel like you would say that
comeback, right? Like this New York City raised kid. He's like, I knew it wasn't a pigeon, right? Like that's the bird I'm familiar with. And there's something, but there's a lot I don't know. And through the book, I hoped to inscribe my learning process in the book as well, so that you can see it's not like, oh, I'm this sort of great authority on creating a native and naturalized plant garden. Like I know all the things. I'm learning the things. I'm just like one step ahead, maybe, of the process.
Yeah, Fran, that was actually a really mature statement of you, because I thought you would have said that like the picking on someone is part of the learning process as well.
Well,
that
was it was in the 70s. And that's a part of my therapy for that is I've actually started writing about my childhood, but not for anyone else to see, just for my own things, to get it out, to have thoughts about it and think about it and remember it for what it was and put it on paper. And I'm like, did it really happen that way? How did this happen? Go through it. And I found that very therapeutic for myself, just from a perspective standpoint, because everyone's always trying to improve, and it's important to know who you are, where you came from, and where you're going. And that's part of my process right now. So
one of the things I wanted to ask is, how do you talk to people who may disagree with your point of view when you're talking about native plants? Have you encountered that through your books and in any critiques or anything like that?
I guess I don't know that they've come to me directly and told me that. I think the the biggest kind of conversation that I can remember that I had, which was really ended up being a really beautiful conversation, was somebody who said that there's a statement that I made earlier in the book about John Muir, who was the great hero of the person I was speaking with. And he heard me say that John Muir wasn't thinking about me, and wasn't thinking about me, and honestly, like, actively in many ways didn't care about me. And he heard that at first as a provocation, and he was very angry, and then sat with it and with what I had written about why I felt like this was an important fact to bring forward, and began to understand how important it was to understand those of us who feel erased from or removed from some of this literature, this policy, this way of thinking, to understand this point of view and why it's really important to broaden the perspectives. And so he was a professor, and essentially he said that by the end of reading this section and thinking about it, it will change the way he thinks about what he teaches and how he teaches. Mm-hmm. So that sounds great to me, that I can say something that's provocative, but that provocation actually lends to conversation, communication, and a broadening of perspective. I'm willing to make somebody mad for a short term if the long term is that.
Yeah. I haven't read your book. Fran has raved about it, and it's on my list now to get to. But it's funny you brought up John Muir, because it's something we've actually talked about here in probably in a similar topic, that what he did was so great for preserving land and making it a public land, but public was of limited scope to him when he did that. And some of it was the time, but probably a lot of it was also his personal feelings as well. So yeah, I'm really interested to read that passage now when we get to it, because it's a really tricky thing to wrap your head around, and he's a hero to so many people, like you were saying. And
there's a lot of reasons why he should be.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I don't think that I don't think it benefits anybody for a hero to be one-dimensional and not, and for us not to interrogate flaws that are built out of character or time, right? Like, what good does that do?
Yeah, and it's actually I heard about some of that on another podcast that just looking back, it was from 2019 is when I heard it, but it was with Dr. Carolyn Finney, and talking about being on public land as an African American person, and that was some of the things she brought up, was how the public lands came about. It was public, but it wasn't meant for everyone in a sense, and this was more about hunting than other things, but talking about how do you get more diversity and equity in outdoor anything, outdoor nature, gardening, all of that, and but with hunting specifics, like, well, why, as an African American person, why would I want to go someplace where I know there's going to be a lot of white people with guns? Was one of the things she said, and it's like, that's a thought that passes through a lot of people's minds when they're thinking, yeah, it's for me, but even there's nothing keeping me out. But why would I want to do that, especially in the political climate and other things that were going on, especially at that time? So, no, that was just so many times when we record, there's like little phrases that are, I don't want to say throwaway things, but not important to the overall interview, that just throw me back to something I heard, in this case, 4 years ago.
And so many cultures celebrate nature in different ways, and it's being tolerant of that. Also, I know how I enjoy nature and how my neighbor enjoys nature are two different completely things. But one's not wrong. It's just our different perspectives on how we enjoy
Sometimes they're wrong.
Oh, well, that's true. That's true. In their case, they're not wrong. But yeah, no, there's totally people where it's wrong. So I knew this would happen. I'm just looking at the time, and I think maybe we only asked you half the questions that we wanted to ask you. So, but there's a couple that I do want to just touch on real quick before we start to wrap it up. Was there an epiphany for you when you felt you found your voice in writing? Was there, or do you still feel you're trying to find your voice, or was there a moment where you're like, you knew that you had found your voice and what you were doing?
Well, every book is a new process. And so now I'm finished with this book and I'm back to staring at blank pages and like, what am I even? But with this book, I think there was a point at which I understood the sort of arc of the story, and how to tell the story in a way that would be engaging and people would want to follow along. And then I could, stick the information, like how deeply you bury an iris bulb versus a crocus bulb, and how to sow sunflower seeds and things like that, and what the nutritional value of a dandelion is. Like I could get all of that information in with story. And so once I figured that out, I just felt like the train had left the station and we were good.
Awesome. To start to wrap it up, for a listener that may be listening and is struggling to find their place in nature, what advice would you give to someone that's looking to connect but is having trouble, or any advice or any tips that you may have?
Yeah. And I think my advice would be very much like my own project, is to start small. You can have a vision of what you want it all to look like by the end, but the likelihood, if you don't know what you're doing, of your being able to successfully and therefore positively bring that vision to fruition if you try to do the whole thing at once is not possible. So start small. And I feel like that is the case with these conversations around diversity and equity. It's the case around gardening. It's the case around any of it. Just start small with one person, one species, one set of pots on your patio, and go from there as you have success and keep building on that.
Awesome. So we always end with the same question, and it's a simple question, but most find it the hardest question to answer. What is your favorite native plant?
I do not find that hard to answer.
Oh, okay.
It is the Nettles larkspur.
Oh.
I love the Nettles larkspur. It's a teeny tiny little delphinium type plant. Not very, maybe the size of each flower is maybe the size of a dime. And it comes back year after year. I don't even really know how my Nettles larkspur got into my rock garden. I think it maybe came from one of those wildflower packets that I threw out, at some point. Some things are bird sown too in my yard. And so maybe that's it. But it comes back year after year. It's got this ferny little leaf structure for a lot of the time, and then these beautiful little purple flowers. And it led me to a lot of knowledge about the place. The man it's named after, Nettle, is a fascinating collector and botanist in North American plant history. And so I feel like it's a little plant with all kinds of perennial interest.
I don't think anyone's ever mentioned that one before. Tom, what do you think?
Yeah,
I think that's the first.
A new one. And at one point, we were trying to put a list together of all the favorite native plants and list it by episode, and that kind of crashed and burned at one point. It was a lot harder thing to put together 100 and some episodes in than we gave it credit for. So.
That is a fantastic choice. Now I have to look into nettles now to learn.
Yeah,
more about
Thomas Nettle tells us a lot about who we are. We plant people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So at this point of the show, we do our final thoughts, and we always start with our guest, and this is where we hand the floor over to you, and you can take as much time as you want. You can summarize, you can promote, you can use it however you'd like, but the floor is yours.
you told me that you were going to do that.
I did.
And you would think that I would have prepared myself better for this. I just really want to say thank you for taking the time to chat. You reached out before soil was in the world, and I ended up on a bit of a whirlwind tour and lost your email pretty much. So I thank you for sticking with me so that I could come here and talk about the book and talk about these thoughts. I think that I just love anybody who's thinking about native plants, large scale or small scale. And one of the last thing I think I might want to say about like why, in addition to all this pollinator bits that we talked about, one of the reasons that I found myself leaning more and more towards native plants is that they are so sturdy. And so in my kind of odd, hot, and then cold and snowy and then hot kind of Colorado climate, these native plants know what to do. And so I don't have to be as fussy as a gardener as I might if I were trying to deal with some other kinds of plants that really weren't meant for this climate. And so for anybody who's thinking about like, I want to do this, but I'm scared, we've talked about like ways that native plants can look kind of gangly, et cetera, et cetera. But I do want to put that out there that after they get established, they're chill. They're like those teenagers that live in the house beside you. And, you know, they pretty much do their own thing.
That's awesome. Nature always finds a way. It amazes me every time I see a native plant in a place that you shouldn't expect to see or you don't expect to see, and they're thriving. And it just always I always find myself taking photos of those going, I didn't expect to see you here, but I'm glad you're here. Glad you found a way. And it's I just love that. That's a fantastic thought.
Yeah. Was that your final thought, or do you have another one?
It's not. Well, I'll make that my thought, but I'll throw this in also. I feel so strongly about this book that I'm hoping we can give away a copy or two to our listeners.
I think that sounds good.
We'll tie it into, we'll pick someone who had given a 5-star review, but you have to write something, and we'll pick something. We'll give it, let's say, by November 1st.
Episode 180.
180. All right, episode 180.
Let me sweeten the pie and say that I will send you signed copies that you can pass along.
I would love that. All right. All right. I would love that. Now I have to enter. I got to do a 5-star review so I can get one. But thank you for being so generous. So let's do that. We feel that strongly that our listeners would not only enjoy this book, we feel that you should read this book. Yeah. And let's do that by episode 180. We're going to pick a couple random winners from 5-star reviews.
Yeah. Write that down so we don't forget.
All right. I'm writing it down right now.
So, and then, my final thought is, like Camille said, start small. Don't do what I did and just do your whole front garden. It can work out. And it actually, I really like it, but it's not everyone's cup of tea. But yeah, start small and then share. You have someone new that moved in the neighborhood. Maybe instead of bringing cookies, bring a native plant. Maybe bring them both, and then they really won't be upset with you. Yeah, and like going to housewarming gifts, parties, that kind of stuff. It's just a good way to be inclusive and share something you already have. And even if it just ends up in a corner of their garden and they don't really think about it, at least you know there's one more native plant out there that's helping. So
awesome. All right, I think that about wraps it up. Go ahead, Tom.
Oh yeah, I forgot I have to do that part, don't I? So that is going to wrap us up for today. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed listening to Camille Dungy. For more information, you can visit her website, which is www.camilledungy.com. Thank you, everyone, for listening to Native Plants, Healthy Planet, presented by Pinelands Nursery.
We'll make sure to put all those links within the show notes also, where you can buy a book. We have to say thank you to the Egocentric Plastic Men for contributing our theme music. Make sure you stream or buy their songs wherever you consume music. Also, thank you to Dave Bennett for a native plant anthem, which is becoming a huge part of the show. Follow us on Twitter at Pineland Nursery, Facebook at Pinelands Nursery NJ, Instagram at nativeplants_healthy planet, and also YouTube at Pinelands Nursery. Don't forget about the question and comment line. You can call us at 215-346-6189. You can ask a question or leave a comment, and we'll play it on a future episode of The Buzz. I'll repeat that number one more time, 215-346-6189. We actually had someone send in we'll play it on the next Buzz, but they sent in the atmosphere sound from a camping trip they did out in nature.
That's cool.
That they shared, and it was just I could have fallen asleep after listening.
Are you sure you want to play that? Maybe it's
not all 10 minutes of it.
Play a couple,
we'll play
30 seconds, then finish off with an air horn to wake everyone back up so they can hear us.
And let's not forget about the Native Plants Healthy Planet Facebook group. Everyone has been so wonderful. We appreciate your kindness and all the new members.
Yeah, so you can buy Native Plants Healthy Planet merch at our website, www.native. Wow, I really screwed that one up.
Ooh, it's been a while.
www.nativeplantshealthyplanet.com. And we have a bunch of different designs up there that you can pick and choose from. And then all the profits from that, we kind of get into a lump sum and then give away to a native plant organization we feel is really doing
our most recent was the Outdoor Equity Alliance.
Yeah. Actually. So you can listen to Native Plants Healthy Planet at our website, but you're probably going to listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher. Stitcher's shutting down.
Stitcher,
you told me, right?
Done. Today is the last day. Yeah.
You can listen on Alexa. Really, wherever you're listening now, you can listen to us again. So if you can do us a big favor and leave us a 5-star review on your platform of choice, that really goes a long way. If you do a little write-up, that gives you your entry to win a copy of soil, a signed copy of soil. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, because that also really makes us, or helps us out and makes us feel good.
It does.
About doing this. So with that, thank you, everyone. I'm Tom.
And I am Fran. Thank you again, everyone. Camille, thank you so much for being a part of this episode.
Thank you for having me.
Anytime. Coming up next week, we have a new episode of The Buzz, so make sure you tune in for that. And until then, keep it native.
Woods, wetlands, and dales grows a bounty of beauty that never fails. Our native plants, so diverse and so rare, treasures of our land beyond compare. From the ferns below, soaring oaks above, each plant has a place, each plant is love. Monarch caterpillars launch milk, wheat so tall, bees buzz about, sipping nectar fall. Oh, native plants, how you grace this land. In your diversity, we will take a stand. To preserve our generations to come, and beauty and potency second to none. To protect and preserve the earth, to restore the native plant move that you just can't ignore.
Goldenrod, asters, and flowers galore. Monarch is so stunning, can't help but adore. Their colors, their fragrance, a feast for the eye. Their value to wildlife, no need to disguise.
Native plants, how you grace this land. In your diversity, we will take a stand.
Thank you for listening to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast, presented by Pinelands Nursery. Remember to like, share, follow, and comment.